And I'll first say that these are my personal views, having done both public service and worked in the private sector as well as in academia, about the importance of change agents in exponential times. Now, on that topic of what is a change agent, first question I'll say is, how many people know what this is? Anyone know what this is? Bill does. What is it?
Body armor?
Yes, it's body armor. It's actually a flak jacket. And the reason why you need to think of a flak jacket when you think of change agents is we need to distinguish the difference between doing what's expected of you and stepping outside of expectations. Management is when we meet the expectations, whether it's the expectations of our boss, our peers, or our reports. And we need to do that to a degree. If we don't meet expectations to a degree, then we're probably quickly out of a job or out of the organization. But leadership is different. Leadership is when you step outside of expectations. In fact, it comes from Greek, which means to sin unto death. Now, you might say, what does that have to do with leadership? Well, back in ancient Greece, the elites were the ones that would carry the flag in front of a melee army. And that's all well and good until one melee army meets another melee army, and guess who's the first to die? The elites. Thus, leadership is being sent unto death. And I highlight that because that's why you need a flak jacket if you're going to be a leader or if you're going to introduce change. Because someone's going to want you to get back into your box. They're going to say, stop stepping outside of expectations, fit into my context of expectations, whether it be your boss, your peers, or reports, and basically do what they expect you to do, maintain the status quo. So that's why I highlight a flak jacket as being important if you're going to be a change agent. Now, Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment as a leader was actually when he had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and actually ask them to make peace with the white minority. His own support base, the ANC, almost threw a coup. Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, his most trying moment was he actually turned to his fellow Israelis and said, we're going to make peace with the Palestinians. And sure enough, unfortunately, he was assassinated by a fellow Israeli. So I highlight that because we often don't distinguish the difference between leadership and management. If you're getting awards, you're probably meeting expectations, you're probably doing management. Leadership, however, you're probably going to be alone, and probably people are going to want you to get back into your box, and that's why you need the flak jacket. So, on that note, first, does anyone know what that dot is? Yes?
That is the entire Earth.
Exactly. It is the pale blue dot. It is our home 3.7 billion miles away. In fact, this photo was actually taken in 1990 when Voyager 1 turned around and actually took a picture of our home. And that's all of us. It literally took 5.5 hours for light to be reflected from the Earth, from the sun, to Voyager 1. And then once it took the photo, it took another 5.5 hours to send the radio waves back to reconstruct that image. And I want to highlight that because it's worth thinking about how rapidly our world has changed since one, Voyager 1 has launched, since two, when Voyager 1 took that picture, and where we are today. So, Voyager 1 happened to launch in 1977. At that time, there's about 4.2 billion people on the face of the planet. Global GDP is about 7.2 trillion US dollars. And for those of you who remember, the Apple II goes on sale with a whopping 4 kilobytes of RAM, which is probably enough for maybe like the first 1 or 2 seconds of an MP3 file. That was 1977. Fast forward to the time that Voyager 1 has now traveled 3.7 billion miles and can take that picture of our pale blue dot, our home. At that point now, there's about 5.3 billion people on the face of the planet. Global GDP has now tripled to about 22 trillion US dollars. Windows 3.0 goes on sale, and even more importantly, on December of 1990, a young Tim Berners-Lee activates the first web server ever, the first one at CERN in December of 1990. 2013, we're now at 850 million web servers on the face of the planet. In fact, this year, 2015 alone, we passed 1 billion web servers, and that's just web servers. 2013 is an interesting year because there's 7.1 billion people on the face of the planet, and it's also the same year that there's 7 billion network devices on the face of the planet. So that's the tipping point in which there's the same number of network devices on the face of the planet as there are human beings. There's also 4 zettabytes. How many people know what a zettabyte is? Oh, come on, we gotta have a few people here. Those who don't, basically, it's a billion terabytes. 4 billion terabytes of data. And just to give you context, 10 terabytes is the Library of Congress. That's how much data we're talking about, is on the face of the planet in 2013. So that was 2013. Now it's 2015. Any guesses as to how many network devices are on the face of the planet just this year alone? 14 billion. It's already doubled. And so now let's look at the year 2022, which is less than 7 years away. 2022, by that year, there'll be anywhere between 75 and 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet. Way more network devices than there are humans. Humans, it's estimated, will probably be at about 8 billion. Global GDP is anybody's guess. 7 billion human beings online. So we still have another 1 billion we still have to get online by 2022. So we still have to close that digital gap. But what's also more interesting is we're at 96 zettabytes of data on the face of the planet. 96 billion terabytes. And I highlight that because that is more data than all human eyes see on the planet in the course of a year. In fact, 96 zettabytes is more data than all conversations our species ever had with each other in the entire history of our species, times 2. That's not linear change. That is exponential change, and it's exponential change happening over the next 7 years. So I highlight that because that is why we're going to have challenges with addressing the world we're going to. So, let me fast forward a little bit to the slides, because apparently I went back. It is worth thinking about, as Voyager 1 made this trip, what else was happening to our world? What other stresses were being felt by societies, and what other stresses were being felt by the way that we do things with the public sector and the private sector. So, this gets to the importance of public service. Now, I define public service as what do we, the people, choose to do together. Now, that may be a US-centric viewpoint, so I apologize for it for international people in the room, but for today's purposes, let's talk about here in the United States, that as a representative democracy, public service is what we, the people, choose to do together. And it's worth thinking about that public service, first and foremost, is about you as members of the public. In fact, I often put the public up top because that's who we are here to serve. But it's also worth thinking about now in this era we're going to with all these connections and with all these devices, maybe the public could play a voluntary role as well of doing things that traditionally only government had to do. Public service is also public-private partners, those that think about interests beyond just themselves, and finally, government professionals. And so it's worth thinking about, if that's the world we're going into with public service, how are we going to address this exponential change that's going to be happening over the next 7 years? So this is another map. It's kind of hard to see in this light. It's actually points of light from space taken in 1995. It's taken by NASA, Earth at night. And it's worth comparing this map to a different map. This is a map of connections. These happen to be Facebook friends in the year 2007. Obviously, there's probably more connections now. What's interesting, though, is it's the world of connections versus points of light, and you see certain parts of the world disappear. Other parts of the world get very bright. And I highlight that because it's really about connections that we're going into as opposed to just points. But in the private sector, if you try and do anything horizontal, you may be eating into your profit margins. That may be actually counter to you actually operating as a company. Or if you try to do anything horizontal in the private sector, that may be antitrust. And that may also be a concern. Same thing's true about the public sector as well. In the public sector, we actually designed at least our form of government to have checks and balances to discourage horizontal collaborations. And in fact, I'll try to point that out a little bit. When the Constitution was signed, there was actually some conversations called the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers number 51 said, ambition should check ambition. They actually wanted a way of actually doing checks and balances because, as they pointed out, what is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all men or women were angels, no government would be necessary. Remember, they had just fought a war against the king. So the last thing they wanted was any one person to have too much power. So they actually wanted individuals to check each other and actually have those checks and balances. And that works until we get into this fast-pacing, moving world where we actually have to think about how are we going to work together horizontally with speed and still have checks and balances. So, another thing I like to point out, in addition to the root of leadership being sent unto death, is experiments and expertise. They both have the root word expert, which is Greek meaning out of danger. And that the only way you get expertise is to do experiments. And the experiments by their nature are dangerous because they won't always work out. We know about in Silicon Valley, the fail fast, fail often model is a way they're actually trying to make sense of this exponential world we're going into. And they can do that because they have an IPO at the end. They have venture capital dollars. Public service, on the other hand, we have taxpayers' dollars, and I think fail fast, fail often probably would not get past the first, if not second try before it showed up in the Washington Post, and whoever was trying to do it would be out of a job. And so the question is, if the world we're going into does not have any textbook, how do we gain the expertise? How do we do the experiments necessary to figure out how do we adapt public service for this rapidly changing world we're going into? In fact, it was worth pointing out that when the Constitution was signed, it's rumored to be said that Ben Franklin was looking at a chair that George Washington was sitting in. And on that chair, there was a sun over the horizon. Ben Franklin is rumored to have said that he can rest easy knowing that it's a rising sun, and the great American experiment will continue to exist for the next 50 years. Now, that was 1789. 50 years have obviously come and gone. We're now at about 240 years since then. It's worth remembering that self-rule is an experiment. And it's worth asking the questions about how do we adapt it, given the world we're into is vastly different than the world of the 1700s. I often like to say that packet latency between New York City and DC back in the 1700s was about 2 or 3 days, and that was one way. That is not the world we're in now. And so it raises some interesting questions. As I mentioned, government, there's a fun quote from the Fellows Papers, one that I hold true and dear to my heart, which says, "What is government itself but the greatest reflections of human nature? If all men or women were angels, no government would be necessary." So it's worth thinking about how do we maintain the checks and balances we want to have, but then move at the speed we need to because the world we're in is moving much faster. So the other thing I also like to point out is oftentimes government gets a reputation of being a bureaucracy, and that's probably fair. But Dilbert would not be a funny comic strip if it only applied to government workers. The reality is Dilbert's universally funny because you'll find bureaucracies everywhere. So it's an interesting question about how we move forward. So let me give you some more sense of the change we're facing and how exponential change is on. We're on this trend of this interesting exponential change that's transforming our world. 2014, there were 1.25 billion smartphones shipped, relative to only 500 million other phones and only 300 million computers. So if there's any doubt, the world is going to mobile, and it's going to mobile much faster than it did with PCs. Similarly, 2014, 2.3 billion mobile broadband connections, with more than half of them in developing nations, not in developed nations. That's also revenue. Yes?
You mind if I ask how you define broadband?
Yeah, so this was the old definition, which was 3 megabits or more per second.
Thanks.
Sure. So that was the case of the world in 2014. The mobile economy in 2014 is 1.2 trillion US dollars. That's about 2% of the world's GDP. The world's GDP is mobile economy. And about 11.5 million text messages are sent per minute. Per minute. That's exponential change. Other things to think about in terms of the scale of data. 2014 per month for the planet was 2.5 exabytes. So that's 2.5 million terabytes of data a month in terms of mobile data. And it's going to grow tenfold by 2019. This is not linear change, this is exponential change. It is going to challenge how we organize, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And my question is, how can we do some thought about it so we're not always trying to be reactive to where we're going? How many people know who this individual is? It's a young Ensign Nimitz. He's with the US Navy. In 1908, a young Ensign Nimitz ran his boat aground the USS Decatur in the Philippines. He was court-martialed but not drummed out of the Navy. Instead, he was assigned to submarines, which at the time was not a glorious thing to be assigned to. But 35 years later, he becomes one of only 2 5-star admirals we ever had in the history of the US Navy. Basically helped us win the war in the Pacific. But I highlight that because that was 1908. Imagine this now instead in the year of 2015. A young ensign or lieutenant runs a boat aground with the US Navy in the Philippines. How long on social media, how long on Twitter and Facebook, how long on the news, and how long with television commentaries would have been, how could Nimitz have ever done that? I'm sure there would have been fire Nimitz as well. And his boss and his boss's boss probably would have been called before Congress, and they probably would have all been drummed out. And we would have been out a future 5-star admiral. Are we selecting for people that are more risk-averse? Because while we are more transparent, and I celebrate we're more transparent as a society, are we also less tolerant of people that make mistakes early on in their careers and learn from them? And this is a question I raise because, in my view, technology is amoral. It's how we humans choose to use it that decides whether it's good or bad. I celebrate the internet's made us more transparent. It's allowed us to have better conversations around the world, but it may also be reducing our attention spans. It may be making us less risk-tolerant of public figures. And what does that mean for the world we're going ahead? So, I don't want to just bring you problems. I actually want to talk a little bit about what we could do to actually try and solve some of these challenges we're going ahead. At FCC, I arrived there about 2 years ago. When I arrived at the FCC was paying probably about something about $3 to $4 million a year for installations in homes to actually test broadband speeds, as well as driving cars around the country to test mobile broadband speeds as well. And actually what the FCC wanted to do was to see, well, could we actually have a voluntary model where maybe the public could opt in, and if they wanted to, they could actually measure the broadband speeds themselves on their smartphone, share that result with a third party that would then share it with the FCC. Now, this was late 2013, and as you can probably imagine, showing up at that time with the US government saying, "Hi, I'm with the government, would you like to download this free app to your phone?" that probably was not necessarily a politically acceptable answer. But what we chose to do was we actually made it open source. So the code is available on GitHub. For those that don't know what GitHub is, it's a repository of open source code. You can check it out if you want. You can fork it, you can modify the code if you want, use it for your own purposes. The code is open source, and if you check the code, you'll actually see that we don't collect your IP address, so we don't know who you are, and we don't know who you are within a 5-mile radius. So it's actually blurred to that level of granularity, so we don't really have precision data. And that actually allowed third parties to actually say FCC is true to its word. They are trying to treat you as anonymously as possible, and if you choose to opt in, this is actually going to be a valuable thing. Turned out it was the 4th most downloaded app right behind Google Chrome on the iOS store for about a month or two, which shows that the public is hungry to do things that traditionally government has had to do just because computational power wasn't there, connectivity wasn't there. It's worth pointing out that if you have a smartphone, how many people in the room have a smartphone? All right, it's almost 100%. You have more computing power in your pocket than President Reagan had available to him through the Pentagon in the 1980s. That's exponential change. And that the next 1 billion people on the face of the planet that are going to get a smartphone that didn't have one before will probably get it for less than $45. That's the world we're going into. And so it raises interesting questions now that we have this computing power available to individuals that we did not have 2 or 3 decades ago. Can they do things that traditionally government has had to do in the past by opting in? They don't all have to do it. In fact, I mean, clearly we weren't getting the entire nation to do this. But we saw, at least in the first week, we saw 50,000 people choose to do it and give us a sampling of broadband connection speeds around the country, all across the country. Are there other things that would be useful? Maybe in public health, maybe in terms of general just sort of social conditions or awareness of things that are going on. This is where it's actually going to be up to each of you here to have thoughts about what could we innovate in the civic space using these devices to work together. How many people have heard of Crisis Commons? A few people. Those who don't, check out crisiscommons.org when you get a chance. Crisis Commons is a place where actually people can use SMS text messaging to share what they're seeing. It actually came first to the forefront when the earthquakes happened in Haiti several years ago. SMS texting was still available, and so people could actually send messages and actually relay what they were seeing. And there happened to be 2 individuals, sisters, one of which was 9 months pregnant. And so her other sister is trying to drive her sister, who's starting to go into labor, to a hospital so she can give birth. Along the way, she's using SMS texting to update her Facebook page. And she's saying, the bridge is down here, I'm going to reroute this way, I can't go across this road, or there's a power line down here. That's one, giving context in terms of what is the state of the disaster that people need to respond to in Haiti. And 2, the US Navy actually had a hospital ship off the coast of Haiti. And through the public SMS texting she chose to do, they could actually identify her location and her sister's location, dispatch a 6-person team, actually rescue them and bring them back to the hospital ship, and they could actually successfully give birth. And I raise this because this is a different model. This is a model of us choosing, almost like a community watch, to share information that will inform the context of a disaster response. Now, you could have false signals here. You could have people not necessarily being completely truthful in what they're saying, but if you get enough people, and if you get enough eyes on the problems, that will quickly balance itself out. There may be 1 or 2 people that give misinformation, but enough other people say, well, no, actually this road is working, or this road is still successful. And I raise that because maybe this is a model we could go to of what David Brin talks about, which is surveillance. It's not surveillance done by authority, it's surveillance in which, much like a neighborhood watch, we choose to opt in, and as a result are safer or more secure as a result. And these things are possible not just with smartphones, but other devices as well. Other question is, how many people have heard of folding at home? We got a few people. Those who don't know about folding at home, it's basically the idea that trying to translate a two-dimensional chemical molecule formula into its 3D shape is very difficult. And if you can figure that out, you can actually design and tailor new drug therapies to cure certain diseases. And so the National Institutes for Health, they spend a lot of money buying new computers to keep up with these computational problems. But what Folding at Home did is said, well, you know, that processor in your PlayStation 3, that processor that's actually in your computer is actually pretty powerful. And if you're not using it, when you walk away from your terminal and the screensaver kicks in, if I could use those computing cycles to actually sort of distribute this problem and help solve it, I may actually be able to find out new things. And as a result of this, people opted in. They loaded this onto their computers to actually figure out these different molecules. And Folding at Home identified at least 5 new drug therapies that would not have been identified otherwise if people not opted in to use their computational cycles. So again, it's this idea of it doesn't have to necessarily be done by the government. It can be done by us, the public, opting into if we want to. It's choice. You don't have to if you don't want to. This recommendation may sound a little far-fetched, but let me give you some context. 2013, there was a competition for $60,000 to see if anyone could write an algorithm that would grade papers as good as a third-grade teacher. Basically, find the same grammatical mistakes, make the same sentence recommendations and things like that that need to be fixed. And for $60,000, someone actually won that competition. It was actually a hedge fund trader that had time on his hands and decided to write the algorithm. 2014, Xerox actually comes out with a copier that will take a handwritten test, handwritten answers, scan it, and grade it for the teacher. Now, don't worry for those of you that are professors in the room. It's still more expensive than professors, so it's not widescreen yet, but it shows what's possible. 2015, I've heard that IBM Watson has been tested in certain Fortune 500 companies to determine which meetings you should go to and which meetings you shouldn't go to. And if you do go to those meetings, who should go to those meetings with you to be more productive. There's also been a case where a company actually elected to its board of directors an algorithm and gave it voting rights. So, this raises interesting questions about, it's not about machines replacing humans, but helping us make smarter decisions as a result, because we have biases. We all, I mean, at least there's, even the most cursory search will show up about 150 different human biases that psychologists have identified, that we each have, in terms of how we perceive the world. On top of that, we also have limited attention spans. We do have to go home at night, we do have to eat and sleep, and so machines, however, can keep on running. And so the question is, can we pair machines with humans and get better outcomes than any one grouping alone? And how would that work forward? I think about in terms of what I do in government, I'd love it if I actually had the ability to actually have the machine, I turn the machine and say, I want to issue a request for proposals for the following type of prototype, for the following type of contracted service. Could you issue this for me? And then in 10 days or so after people have had a chance to respond, give me the top 5 candidates, so then I can make the final selection. And actually let the machine do it as opposed to a very laborious human acquisition process. This is actually where I will share an interesting story too about acquisition. For those of you that have been experienced in acquisition, it's not the easiest thing to be done in the public service space because we have to make sure it's fair, we have to make sure that it's as equitable as possible. It's usually about at least 100, 200, 300 pages of documents that need to be done. But guess how much it was in the 1950s to acquire the U-2 spy plane? 2 pages. Not saying, that we immediately go back to 2 pages, but it's worth trying to think about, can we at least streamline the process? Because at least for what I try to do when I want to move with speed, if it takes me at least 6 to 9 months to procure something, by that time the world's already moved on exponentially.
Well, maybe we should just go back to 2 pages.
Exactly.
Get rid of data.
2 pages, well, but you still want to also make it fair. So I don't want it to be someone that has a relationship doing something like that, but maybe the machine can help make it fair.
We don't need all this information. What we can do with it.
Right, and maybe it's 2 pages for the human and something else for the machine. But it's an interesting question about how can you streamline it and still keep it fair, because at the end of the day, we do want to make it sure it's fair and there's not vested interest. But I highlight that and say, we've obviously were able to do it for 2 pages back in the 1950s, so it's a goal to aim for at least.
Yeah.
Other questions on that? All right. How many people have heard of the Makers Movement? Good, excellent. We've got a lot of people in the Makers Movement, good. This to me is the most interesting trend, which is basically the idea that hardware and software that used to be only available to either large corporations or nation states is now inexpensively available to individuals, and they can do interesting things with it. This photo over here, these 3 individuals were able to, for less than $45, using a Raspberry Pi and some other things they had in their local environment, for $45, build a urine-powered generator so they could actually read at night in their local environment in Nigeria. Over here as well, that's actually in Ghana, and for 50 bucks, they were able to use a smartphone, SMS texting, and a Raspberry Pi as well to build a baby monitor that will send 40 different vital signs through SMS text messaging to any doctor in the world. This is where we're going, in which things that used to only be available to nation states or large corporations are now in the hands of individuals, and they can remix them and do interesting things with them. To me, that's very exciting. But again, remember what I say, that technology is amoral. It's how we choose to use it that determines whether it's good or bad. And so as a cautionary note, I often like to point out that the Mumbai terrorist attacks, unfortunately, also use social media, also use Google search, also use GPS to decide how to plan the attacks, to do the attacks, and unfortunately also identify who they needed to execute. So we need to raise these interesting questions about how do we deal with a world in which people are now going to have in their hands technologies that were only available to large corporations or nation states in the past. And how do we ideally try to encourage good choices as opposed to bad ones? So, Internet Protocol version 4. I don't want to get too geeky, but for most of you, this is what most of the Internet is built on, although we're moving to Internet Protocol version 6. It allows you to address 2 to the 32, which is about 4.3 billion unique addresses on the Internet. Now, if we take all those addresses on the Internet, this is again most of the Internet that you deal with now, and put it in a beach ball, how big is Internet Protocol version 6, the world we're going into in the next 2 to 3 years? Any guesses? I'll give you a hint, it's 2 to the 128th. But in terms of size, we're going to the sun in just about a few years. So the Internet you've experienced up until now is the beach ball. The Internet you will experience 3 to 4 years from now is going to be the size of the sun. There's huge opportunities, but there's also huge challenges that come with it. Most notably, cybersecurity. How do we protect privacy? How do we just deal with this huge scale and literally almost explosion of network devices? This is going to be interesting challenges for all sectors, private sector, public sector, academia, nonprofits. It's going to require us to do experiments, dangerous experiments to get that expertise needed to deal with the exponential era we're going ahead in. So I'll end with a closing thought, and then I'll go to questions. This is us again. This is a more recent photo. This was actually when Cassini turned around and took a photo in 1994 of Earth. Obviously, it's passing past Saturn. You can probably recognize those rings. And Carl Sagan said, look at that dot. That's here. That's home. Everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Hopefully you're going to be change agents in our exponential time. I look forward to questions. Thanks a lot.